Egyptians ignore calls for a nationwide strike. The planned protest was supposed to coincide with the 80th birthday of President Hosni Mubarak, who's been in power since 1981. Do Egyptians tend to stay out of politics as long as there's food on the table, or do they feel intimidated by the state? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome. I'm Jane Dutton. So as Egypt's latest strike flops, the government responds to a 30% public sector pay hike with the threat of drastic fuel increases. This after a casual invitation on the internet for a general strike resulted in a massive protest and bloody confrontations with security forces last month. Egyptians are known for their patience and laid-back attitude, but it seems that's all changing. Mohammed Shoher reports.
This is what the Egyptian government wanted, business as usual, in the capital, Cairo. They achieved this with a classic technique, the stick and carrot. It seems to have succeeded in discouraging Egyptians from taking part in a general strike planned to coincide with President Mubarak's 80th birthday.
I kept the shop open all the time. The business is slow. What can I do? Myself and my wife are here working in the store to be able to feed my family.
Dozens of would-be student demonstrators were locked up in jail despite their families' protests. Extra police were deployed in Cairo and in the Nile Delta town of Mahal al-Kubra, which saw clashes last month between striking textile workers and police. The government warned that once again, dissent would not be tolerated. Despite the Muslim Brotherhood's support and the high participation of Egyptians on the internet, the call for civil disobedience did not get people on the streets. This has been attributed to heavy security with threats of harsher punishment against striking employees. And the preemptive 30% increase in wages announced by the president 4 days ago. It seems that President Mubarak, over his nearly 27 years of rule, has used a mixture of platitudes and harsh security measures to contain the anger of the people.
The increase should have been around 15%. I said it should be more. Not even 20% would be enough. 25%? No. I told them not less than 30%, and the government should find the resources.
This seems to have foiled the planned strike, thus raising questions about the credibility and effectiveness of bloggers and young internet activists. They have often been accused of being in a virtual world of their own, not really connected to the suffering majority, a majority which is bearing the brunt of food prices that have risen sharply in recent months, much more than the global surge in commodity prices. For the time being, prices are stable, but the root causes of the price hikes are not being treated. And as the Egyptian establishment celebrates the birthday of the president, Egyptians still wonder who is responsible for their hardship and how much harder life has to get before it begins to improve. Mohammed Shoher for Inside Story.
Well, joining us to discuss this issue are our guests in Cairo, Abdel Monem Sayed, head of Al Ahram Center for Strategic Studies, and Hassan Naifeh, professor of political science at Cairo University and Secretary General for the Arab Thought Forum. In London, Robert Springborg, director of the Middle East unit at SOAS University. Mr. Sayed, the strikes called on Mubarak's birthday were a flop. What do you think happened there?
I think what happened, because it was a flop, there is no major social forces stood behind it. Trade unions did not stand behind it. Major student unions did not stand behind it. All political parties did not stand behind it. It was a virtual thing, and it was, in another way, a media event. Even the Muslim Brothers, who this time worked in an accommodative way with the idea of strike, they really asked most people to go to work on the basis of being, if the country in need of you, you got to go to your work. It ended up also with what the government package that it was represented to the people. It was not only the 30% raise in the salaries of government employees, but also the increase of number of people under subsidies from 11 million to 15 million. doubling the quantities of subsidies, and increasing also the very lower employees of the municipalities by about 75%. So there is a general package that the government could afford because of the 7% growth rate that Egypt is achieving in the past few years. So it was actually because it was a virtual internet thing, and without a leadership, without a clear program of what those who want to strike to achieve. There was a package of complaints about rising prices, food prices, complaints against the political system.
Okay, let me jump in there and bring Mr. Nafa in. Let's talk about the leadership. Where was the leadership? It certainly seems to be a case of dirty hands, clean feet.
Yeah, I think those who has called for the strike would say that the strike was a success even before it started, because the government has reacted in a preemptive way to raise the salaries. I think, and also we have to understand that the students who are usually politically active are in almost vacation now. They don't go to the university, so the sectors who are vibrant, the vibrant sectors in the society were calm in a way. But I think most of the civil servants also were triggered by fear. They couldn't, if they didn't show up, there will be a punishment against them. But I would recognize that the opposition also is very much divided, and there is no leadership for the opposition, and those who has called for the strike are young. Those feel very badly the crisis of the regime.
And those young using the internet, and only 8% of Egyptians have access to the internet. But Mr. Springborg, to bring you in there, fear must have played a big factor in this, and individual rights are not protected by law in Egypt.
Well, I'm not so sure that fear was the dominant motive. I think what it illustrates is that the virtual reality of electronic connections are not as forceful as face-to-face communications within a political organization. And the political organizations, as you've just heard, either were not engaged in the strike or are themselves too weak to really mobilize people into the street. So I'm not sure that fear is certainly a factor, but you have to have organizational sinews to enable people to overcome the fears, as also to organize a strike like that logistically. And the organizational sinews outside of the Muslim Brotherhood are just not strong enough in Egypt. And within the Brotherhood, the brothers are very careful about provoking the regime. They're already in a struggle with the regime. And to have an all-out confrontation in the streets is too big of a risk for the brothers. So
certainly no political will there. But let's talk about the political response. So the government has just announced it's going to increase fuel prices dramatically to pay for the 30% increase to government salaries. Is that the way to go?
Well, they have to find the money somewhere. They're running a budget deficit about 8% of GDP right now. They are digging themselves further into an economic hole as a result of increasing salaries by 30%, 5.5 million government employees. And then, of course, the government requested the private sector to also pass on wage rises of about that amount. Here in London, in conversations shortly before this announcement occurred from the president, I was told that fund managers were making frantic calls to head economists for a large bank in the Middle East, saying, is it, what's going on in Egypt? Is it safe to have our money there? So there's a lot of worry in global fund managers and others who invest money in Egypt as to whether or not we're reaching a point at where this magical 7% growth rate is now going to be under serious threat because of a runaway budget deficit.
And do you think
it
will be?
The government had to do something. Well, I mean, the fuel subsidy is the really big one in Egypt. It's the really costly one. So that they have some meat there that they can cut into to try to reduce the size of the deficit. And I don't know, I haven't seen any accounts yet of what the impact of reducing the fuel subsidy is going to be. But there's something there they can play with, so they may be able to balance it out. But they're walking a very thin line here because the world is watching very closely as to what is the economic impact of the salary raise is going to be. And if it's really going to cause the budget deficit to go up much above 8–9%, then people are going to pull their money out of the pound, the Egyptian pound, out of the equity market in Cairo, and then Egypt's going to have real trouble.
Mr. Nafa, isn't one of the problems here that despite these increases, I mean, it's not addressing the root causes?
Yes, of course. I think temporarily that might appease the situation, but when the government will seek resources to finance this raise in salaries, they will be facing a real difficult situation. And I think there will be some other taxes on fuel and other basic goods, and in a very short time, the whole population will feel that what the government has given by the left hand has taken by the other hand. So it is a deep crisis in the regime, and I think it is not basically economic and social crisis. It is mainly political one, and I think the gap between the rich and the poor people is widening, and unless there is a change in the basic orientation of policies, social and political policies, the regime will continue to witness a crisis, and it is going deeper. There is no any alleviation. Okay,
excuse me interrupting, Mr. Syed. Why has the government not invested in its people? I mean, 80% of Egyptians are poor. Many in the rural areas don't even have clean water. Why don't they invest in water? Why don't they invest in land?
I guess the numbers are wrong. You know, all the World Bank numbers are the people under $2 per day are 20%. There are another 20% that close to that. But actually, there is a big investment in Egypt. If we look at it in terms of education, in terms of health, Egyptian health life expectancy increased by about 13 years in the last 25 years. And in general, the people who called for the strike are a product of a big social revolution that's taking place in Egypt. And if you give me a little bit time, that now the government revealed its program, and in fact, it's making from the situation right now an opportunity for more reforms. Actually, they're cutting into the subsidies, and the subsidies for any who is making more fortune in the country. The subsidies that goes in terms of energy for industries that's making now, because of worldwide prices, higher profits. They already will pay more. There is increase on the solar, which is used by tourist industry, which is booming in Egypt. And also they are relying on increasing of cigarette prices. So there is already about $13 billion have been, billion Egyptian pounds have been already managed out of the 15 billion that will be the cost of the new price hike.
Okay, let's take a short break now, because when we come back, excuse me interrupting, we've got to explore the future of Egypt, and that could take a while. Do stay with us.